So when we're talking about risk management, let's talk about a scenario first. So we'll talk about personal and then we'll talk about it cybersecurity related. Now I want you to take a moment and think, okay, you're going to go on vacation and you're wanting to post your pictures on social media, right? Now everyone wants to post their pictures on social media and they really enjoy doing that. But keep in mind, when you post things on social media, well, then two things happen. Sure, some of your friends will know that you're in a certain place and they'll be like, hey, I'm in this place too. Let's meet up. However, the other side of it is that if you're away from your home and you post on social media, then other people will know that you're not home, that your home is empty. So this could potentially make thieves be interested in stealing it. I once heard of a couple, they did van life and they looked on social media to find anyone who is on vacation. Then they would go to their home, they would go into their home and steal whatever they could, steal whatever food, steal anything that was valuable, and then they would sell that to fund their van life. This is an example of social media being a part of what we call OSINT, which stands for excuse me, which stands for open source intelligence. So OSINT is anything that you can find publicly online. This is why I always encourage everyone to turn their social media profiles to private, meaning that only people that you accept to be your friends or your followers can see what you actually post. So this is really important because um, these everyday decisions are what we call balancing risk and reward. Sure, you get the reward of the dopamine once your friends like your pictures, but then at the same time, you risk the chance of exposing more information than you have to. If you're still worried about how do I express myself, it's very simple. Just post the pictures a week after you've been gone. No one needs to know what you're doing or where you are every single day. You can do it a week later and they won't know the difference. If anything, it's a lot more fun because they're like, oh, wow, you're here. You're like, oh, I was there last week. Because then you're still at home. Now, if we kind of shift our perspective, and let's say we are a company called Let's Go, right? So we're this company and it's a travel business. And we are the cybersecurity resources that are in charge of taking in customer data, taking in customer information. Now, when we're taking in customer data, we have to understand that we as cybersecurity professionals have to treat this data like gold. If we mishandle the data, like mishandling this data here, it could lead to legal troubles. It could lead to lost customer trust. It could lead to a wealth of issues. I guarantee you right now that the legal department and the cybersecurity team are barely sleeping because of this, because this app and this business is going to get hit extremely hard because of it. So the entire idea here is we want to talk about risk management and risk regulations. I'll break those down a little bit later in class. But for starters, I want us to kind of talk about what we'll get through. So we're going to talk about risks, which in very simple terms is a possible event or an issue that could cause harm or disruption. Then we're going to talk about risk management, which is the management of these possible disruptions. Regulations, which can be both legal as well as illegal things that need to get done or very specific rules. And then different frameworks that you can do to protect or implement risk management. So by the end of this, my hope is that you'll be able to define all these terms. You'll be able to explain what a regulation is to you all. The one we're going to focus on is GDPR. And then we're going to talk about the different frameworks you can implement in order to do that. Okay? So think of it as risk management is a way to plan ahead and think ahead so that you can make more informed decisions. Now, keep in mind that a risk isn't an active incident. Like we talked about incident before, right? We need to validate if it's an incident. A risk is a thing that could potentially happen. We'll talk about likelihood and whatnot. I see a question. Can someone make this a career strictly on risk management? Because I see some postings in the hospital with such roles. 150%, Sylvester. Risk management is a great career. I had mentioned this before in several classes, but you could also do what we call third-party risk management. This is the process of evaluating anytime a vendor comes through or anytime you are going to be working with a new partner. Well, when you do risk management, you're looking to see if there are any vendors or suppliers that could cause risk to you and your system. This typically comes in the form of a questionnaire of some sort. Or you could be a risk manager in general or a risk yeah, a risk manager. It is 100% a career, and you can definitely do it. It does pay pretty well, so highly suggest. Now the risk management domain, it does fall a little bit under the GRC domain, but some depending on what company you are and its structure, it does exist. Highly recommend it. All right. That being said, let's do it. So first, let's talk about risk and reward. So when it comes to risk and reward, we need to kind of get a clear definition of what risk is. Like I said, risk is the possibility of something happening or the chance that the outcome of an action will be different than what you expect. AKA, if if I lie in bed for an extra 5 minutes or so, that's a risk that I'm taking because I'm like, I'll be fine. If I sleep in bed for 5 minutes, that's fine. It's no biggie. But you're not taking into consideration that there could be extra traffic. I've done this so many times, and then you could be late. I'm a very punctual person. At least I try to be. And sometimes I just skim it a little bit. I just risk a couple minutes just for a little bit of peace. So that's an example of a risk, like a very simple one. And then another example of a risk would be, let's see, a risk would be like playing poker. If you've ever played poker or if you've ever gone to Vegas and done betting, you are risking money for a potential win. Now, with that comes like percentages and margins, but the concept of a risk is that you're potentially going to lose something. It's not like fully realized. It's not 100% that you're going to lose it, but there is a possibility of such. Now, why would you do that? The main reasons why people would do that is due to what we call a reward. The reward, in very simple terms, is a benefit that you gain. If you play poker and you read someone's hand well, then you make money. However, if you don't, you lose. So you have to do what we call a risk and reward trade-off. So the risk and reward trade-off is essentially where every decision is going to be based on the risk and reward and how risky you want to be versus the reward that you want to get. In the concept of poker, there's the concept of being a very loose player. That means that you tend to bet a lot even when you don't have good cards. That means you're being very risky. Now, there are statistics that say some of that does well, some of that doesn't, what have you. But in those different situations, you have to weigh your options. Now, you weigh your options based on what we call a risk appetite. So risk appetite is essentially the amount of risk that you, the organization, is willing to take. If you have a high risk appetite, that means that, oh, we don't care, we're good with this, it's not going to happen. It means that you'll tolerate a lot of risk. If you have a low risk appetite, that means that you say, nope, we want this risk to be mitigated. We want this risk to be transferred. You have a bunch of situations where you don't want as much risk as possible. Risk tolerance is the level of uncertainty or risk an organization is willing to accept. That means I'm willing to tolerate this amount of risk. If I have 10 risks, I'm willing to tolerate 2, but the rest, other 8 have to be mitigated. If I have 8 risks, well, then my risk tolerance is 5. I'll be like, okay, we need to take care of 3, 5 is okay. So let's kind of do a little vote here. There are going to be a lot of these votes thread. So here's the vote thread. You can say yes or no. So you have to decide if you should buy a travel insurance for the upcoming trip. The reward is you save $35 by opting out. If you get sick and can't travel, you lose 500 of your non-refundable. So the question is does the risk outweigh the reward? Yes or no? So does the risk outweigh the reward? Consensus. Everyone says no. That is correct. So the potential loss, 500, is greater than the cost, 35. So the risk outweighs the reward. There you go. Second scenario, you have to decide whether to accept a new management position. The reward is you earn more money, but then you may work longer hours. You may need to manage a coworker who likes to start fights and kind of like unhappy. So the question is, um, risk or reward? Everyone says yes. All right, that is correct. So these are all scenarios where we're talking about risk and reward. So I think you all are getting the picture. And then last one here. So in this last scenario, you have to decide whether to invest in Bitcoin. So your investment could grow 2 times, or the risk is that there may be new regulations that drop value and you lose all your money overnight. So any money that you invest is fully, you have to be prepared to lose. So yes or no? I'm seeing a lot of no's. Now, with Bitcoin, it's based on like your decision, right? So whenever you're making decisions like this, especially when it comes to investing, because the market can be can fluctuate a lot, you have to essentially exactly what Umair says. It depends on your risk tolerance. So in this case, if you're going to put anything into Bitcoin, you have to essentially just say, hey, I'm just going to believe that when I put money here, it's gone. I don't have it anymore. It's like a sunk cost. But that depends. So there are a lot of yes, no answers because people are going to have different risk tolerances in this case. So keep that in mind as we keep talking about cybersecurity and risk, because it's going to play a really big part in overall security posture. So let's kind of talk about risk in cybersecurity. Now, in this case, when we're talking about risk, it's talking about the chance that a threat will exploit a vulnerability or a weakness. It could cause harm to digital systems. It could cause the company a lot of financial damage. That is the concept of a risk. Now, there's a really big distinction that I want to make here because there's risk, threats, and vulnerabilities. And you have to know the difference between the three because you might get asked this in a quiz or a test or in an interview. In this case, a threat is, which includes people or groups, or can be like individuals or group attempting to gain unauthorized access to the data or the network. So that's all a threat is, people trying to gain access to a network. A risk is the chance that a threat will exploit the vulnerability. You see the words I'm using there? A risk includes the threat, which is people and groups, will trying to exploit a vulnerability, which is a weakness that can be exploited. So keep in mind that threat and vulnerability are included in the definition of a risk. And so that's really important to understand because in cybersecurity, especially if you want to get into the risk management domain, understanding those three elements is critical. Now, why this is important is because we are all trying to prevent a very hard impact. Now, the impact is the damage or the scale of the damage that could be caused by a threat being successful. So the impact could be financial, it could be a huge data breach, it could be reputational harm, it could be a legal impact. These are all things that could happen if we don't mitigate the risks, because the risk cover the threats and the vulnerabilities. That's why risk management is so huge and why it covers so many areas. Now, when we're talking about the concept of risk, there are two types of risks that we need to keep in mind. The first one is an external risk, which is someone that's outside, and then there is an internal risk. Now, when I'm saying when I'm saying an external risk, that is considered like a hacker group or another country trying to hack another country. It could be a third party vendor. So remember, I mentioned third party risk management. Well, a third party vendor could be a potential risk because they don't have all the right security controls, which is why this entire role exists. And then another risk that we talked about in the past when we talked about incident response are things caused by nature, earthquake, flood, fire, any sort of event or disaster that could impact the organization. Those are all external, meaning that it's happening to the organization. Now, another threat is called an internal threat. And the internal threat are things that are happening within the organization from the inside out. So this means people and processes within the company. And that that would include the concept of, like in the case of the T app, overlooking any risk or overlooking any vulnerabilities. So what are some of those what are those some risks? Well, one of those internal risks that happen within the company is the human risk. Keep in mind, over 80% of incidences that happen are due to human error. The T app is a prime example. They did not secure the data server that was holding all of those pictures. And so they had an issue. That is what we call negligence. When they expose data by misconfiguring systems or not putting the right security controls in place. So that is what we call human risk. Things are also like phishing attacks, which we've gone over in depth, as well as insider threats, which we've also gone over in depth. So the human risk is a big element. The next one is a technical risk. So the technical risk in this case is if you don't secure laptops, something as simple as not putting a passcode on your laptop or making your passcode 4 zeros. I don't know if you saw, but a really long time ago, there was a camera that caught Kanye West unlocking his phone, and it was just 4 times. So that is considered an unsecured device because that's going to be one of the first things people will try. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 0000. That's why iPhone gave the option to do a 6 password option. So securing your devices properly for access control is important. Next is like things such as poor passwords and reusing passwords, having really bad firewall rules, or like you all remember, when you want to secure a network or a device, the first thing you have to do is close unused ports. So those are examples of technical risks. And then you have what we call operational risks. Now, operational risks are a little different. They're disruptors. There are things that are kind of like causing an issue for operations not to happen. Anytime you see the word operations, just think of it as day-to-day activities. So if there was a fire, everyone's day-to-day activities would stop because they need to get out of the fire. Same thing if there was another natural disaster or a power outage. If there was potentially like a major layoff, and if the HR and leadership team didn't plan correctly and they laid off a majority of the IT and security team, well, then the remaining resources are going to have to know how to take on those roles or do the things that they were doing before. So if all of these operational risks take place, they could cause a lot of failures or even what we call dependency failures. Now, what a dependency failure is, it's when one part of a system or part of an organization doesn't work as well because one of their dependencies isn't there. An example is if you were to fire the entire payroll team, as in people who pay employees, well, then someone on the HR team will say, hey, I don't have XYZ from the payroll team. I can't do payroll. That is a dependency failure. And the last thing that we'll talk about is regulatory risk. Now, regulatory risk, which we'll talk about a little later on, there's a full section, it's just in relation to laws. When you see the term regulatory, we're talking about legal. This means that these are actual laws that take into account. Now, if you're ever interested in GRC, if you're interested in privacy, if you're interested in risk management, you do have to become familiar with the laws that are operating in your country and in your industry, because these new laws come about all the time. Different governments decide on new laws that depend on the conflict or depend on the current business model, the current situation that they're in. Now, you might be asking, well, what if someone is not compliant? Well, if you're not compliant with regulations, well, then that could result in fines. An example is GDPR. It's either you pay $2,000 or $20 million if you're not compliant, or they take 4% of your revenue, which could be a lot. So if you're going to remember anything, just remember that risk is a combination of threat, vulnerabilities, and impact, because threat and vulnerabilities is in the definition of risk. This is one of the most important things that I highly encourage you all to remember, because it really is differentiating. Okay. These are all one family, like risk, threat, and vulnerabilities. Yeah, if I were to say, I would say that risk would be the grandparent, and then threat and vulnerabilities would be like the parent, the kids. Are there any tools in order to assess and analyze risk level? So many, Saida. That's a good question. So many. But I will get into some of them in the second half of the lecture. So let's carry on here. Let's talk a little bit about risk trade-off. Now, if you remember, I was talking about risk and reward trade-off, right? And how you have to make a decision based on that. Well, let's kind of talk about that a little bit. When you're talking about cybersecurity, decisions are really, really important. So you have to weigh the security risk versus the business reward. A lot of the time, a lot of companies care more about the financial coming in and the financial benefit than taking care of some of the cybersecurity risks. Now let's take our little Let's Go travel agency company, for example. So the team has to evaluate or make a decision if the benefits of security changes are worth the possible downsides. For example, if we're going to implement, hey, a lot of our customers, we want all of our customers to do two-factor authentication. Well, that's going to cost us some IAM, identity access management tools. That's going to cost us to have a server to do the access management and access control. That's going to cost us a lot of time, and customers might be unhappy with that additional one. I'm using that because it's very common. It's very common for customers to be like, why do I have to do two-factor authentication? I know for a fact that at NASA, they have to do nine two-factor, nine-factor authentications. So anytime they log in, they have to do 9. As you can imagine, it's because they have so much data and security that it needs to be done properly. So what you have to do in this case is, yes, it's important to evaluate the business environment. So think of the financial conditions, what the financial impact would be, what the social impact would be, and then you think about the threat. Is there an increase in people trying to do brute force attacks on our customers? Have a bunch of our customers been exposed? Has our data been leaked? So when you take all of these into consideration, that helps you make a very sound decision. So in this case, let's do another check. Let's do a vote thread again. So now we're going to make decisions and trade-offs if you think that the reward outweighs the risk. So first, you have to decide whether users should be required to use two-factor authentication to log in. Users will be less likely to have their accounts compromised and lose data, but the risk is it will reduce the number of new users because they'll be annoyed that they have to sign in. So does the reward outweigh the risk? Yes or no? Does the reward outweigh the risk? I have a pretty clear answer on this. That is correct, everyone. So the answer is yes. Anytime anyone asks you, why do I have to do two-factor authentication? That's so annoying. Well, then you can tell them and say, well, would you rather spend an extra 30 seconds doing two-factor authentication or spend a week trying to get your account back or trying to get your data and identity back? So if you put the concept of time in front of the people, then they start thinking, or you make them think, so what would happen if you lost all of your data, or if you didn't have access to your Gmail, or if you didn't have access to your phone? Well, then they'll be like, oh, that'd be terrible. That would impact my life greatly. Well, then you're either going to have a major impact on your life or a minor impact on your life. I've just accepted the fact that two-factor authentication is in my life forever. I don't
I think we lost Andre.
Oh, are you
Well,
all there? Can you all hear me?
welcome back, Andre.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that. Okay, as I was saying, the answer to this one, you have to decide whether credit card details or the phone, or whether they should input them via automated link to phone number. So phone agents won't be able to copy users' financial information, or corporate travelers whose admin may have booked the travel will not be able to change or make changes over the phone. Everyone is saying yes again. That is correct. Well done. Moving on now to scenario number 3. So you have to decide whether to design a security patch for the website to cover newer web browsers. The company could save $200K in engineering costs by only developing a patch for the latest web browsers. And risk, 12% of customers on older unsupported browsers won't be able to access the website anymore. So yes or no? All right, we're getting some mixed answers. Okay, so the answer in this case is actually no. So the reason why I say that is because when we're talking about 12% of customers, that's actually a really big number. So when we exclude a part of the users, that could have a pretty big financial impact. And we might be alienating some loyal customers. Now, why that's important is because a lot of the it's been proven that the older generation tend to be more loyal. The generation tends to use older tech, which is why patching exists, because those loyal customers tend to bring a good income. So it is in our benefit to actually support those older browsers, because then it helps us build additional brand reputation as well as just gets us additional income. Can't we just update them? Peter says. The idea here, I think I know what you mean, Peta, is you're saying, why can't these older users update them? Well, the problem is these are customers outside of our network, so we don't have control over their browser version. They have to be the ones to update it. So it's the browsers that have to force that update. There are ways around it, though. I know some people that are using old browsers because they like how fewer ads are on them. Sure, it makes it a little difficult to like get on some of those newer websites that have a bunch of scripts. However, it works. So with risk trade-off, the idea here is trying to see if your reward outweighs the risk. And this is very, very common in cybersecurity. Excuse me, a lot of people will fight cybersecurity and say, this is annoying, we don't want to do it. So you always have to bring up the concept of risk versus reward. So, someone asked earlier, well, are there any tools in order to find this out? Well, yes. Now, in order to understand these tools, we need to understand the processes that come with risk. And one of the first things you need to know is the first step is risk identification. There's something called the risk management process, and risk identification is step 1. Risk identification is essentially the process of recognizing potential threats that could impact the business, that could impact operations. So when I say recognizing it, it literally means finding out what those threats are and then mitigating them. Let me just jump in here. I hear you, Grace. Yeah. Yep. Yes. Emmanuel, yep, I hear you. So those numbers could be it's true that we don't have a lot of all of those customer numbers. However, in this case, just take the concept. The concept is if we did have the numbers and we did see that 12% was a big number, then that would still apply. Now, let's get back to risk identification. Again, this means recognize the potential threats that could interfere And that would then be able to inform your decision making. So once you're able to identify what those are, then you can analyze, you can mitigate, you can make decisions on those actual threats themselves. Now, keep in mind, a risk is identifying threats and vulnerabilities that would have an impact on your business. I'm going to write that down so everyone can memorize that. A risk is identifying the threats and vulnerabilities that will impact the business. And you can save that and you can remember that as like my own definition of risk, because then it makes it clear cut and straightforward. Now, what are some of the ways that you can identify risk? Well, I know someone asked if there are applications. However, sometimes you have to talk it out, which is why brainstorming is one of them. Brainstorming is essentially a technique you use to identify a risk in the sense that you gather everyone into a room and you talk. You ask them, you ask the diverse group, okay, what are the threats? What are the risks? What are the vulnerabilities that you, your group, your department, your organization, your product is going through or that you know of? Now, you want to have it in a group setting because then other departments can see what risks or threats there are and if those threats are dependencies or would impact their department. A very simple one is if you're working in the HR department and the IT team says, hey, we have a risk that all of the data that we're storing, because HR does not do anything in regards to secure data storing. That's IT. So the IT team can say our data is stored in very like basic stuff. We don't have any encryption. Well, the HR will be like, hey, that's a big risk. We care about that because if your data is stolen, well, then our HR team is in big trouble. We're going to have to like pay the employees. Legal will definitely be like, hey, you need to encrypt that like yesterday, right? These are all, that's why you have it in a group so that you can have a structured discussion to know what the possible risks are. When you're having it in a group, you're essentially encouraging different perspectives, and then you're essentially making it a bit broader. Then, because the concept of threat modeling. So threat modeling is essentially where you create possible attack scenarios and where you find out where the vulnerabilities are. You'll hear the term threat modeling and it sounds a little fancy and stuff, but it's really not. It's just it's just like playing pretend, saying, "Hey, guess what? This is an attack scenario, and let's pretend we do it, and these are the vulnerabilities that we found." Now, this is a bit more technical because it follows something that we call STRIDE. So STRIDE, in essence, is where you're using like spoofing, you're using tampering, you're using repudiation and information disclosure, denial of service, and elevation of privilege in order to successfully do an attack or a threat. The last one is important. An elevation of privilege is when you get access to a system and then you can create a username and password of an admin level, meaning you can do anything essentially. So that's elevation of privilege. So when you're doing threat modeling, it helps teams be able to build more secure systems before they actually make the deployment. The threat modeling process happens when you're trying to build something new. We'll skip that for time. And then you have interviews and surveys. This is in very simple terms where you're talking directly with employers, customers, and partners to understand what they think are the vulnerabilities. Now, a lot of customers also use this as a time to complain, but when you use a survey, that's when you gather additional insights to scale. Now, this is really great because you're discovering risks that may not be visible internally. Your customers and your partners, even some of your employees, may see some risks that you don't from a user perspective. So that's why they're helpful. Checklists and templates is simply saying you're using industry best practices or you're using past templates or past checklists that have been used in your industry that have worked really well. These are called risk checklist templates. So you can look those up. And then you can do what we call a SWOT analysis. So a SWOT analysis stands for weaknesses, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So the reason why this is used in risk management is because we're identifying any external opportunities and threats, and then we're evaluating where our strengths and weaknesses are. This 4-quadrant analysis kind of like lists out strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, combines all that information in order to give us like a really good picture of where we stand. Root cause analysis we've talked about in the past, where you identify the underlying cause. If you remember, we talked about lessons learned in the past, right? That is a form of risk management, because when you do a lessons learned, you will find the root cause. When you do a root cause analysis, you do what we call prevention. Like I said before, cybersecurity, you can prevent a lot of things.
Andre, we cannot hear you. Sorry. You're still here. Yes, welcome back.
Oh, I apologize. Okay. The other one is environmental scanning. So environmental scanning just means that you're scanning your network to see if there are any threats, as simple as a vulnerability scan or an Nmap scan. And then technical surveillance. This is when you have automated tools that scan and analyze your network, such as an IDS, which is intrusion detection system. Keep in mind, this is passive. It just alerts if there's an intrusion, and then it gives the details. All right. I think we can also skip the practical example for time. Now, if you're going to remember anything when we're coming to risk identification, just keep in mind that we have to keep the human element at play when we're making these decisions, because humans are a really big risk factor and there's no way around it. But then we also have to keep in mind that there are technical tools that we can use to identify those risks, such things as environmental scans, tech scans, interviews, and brainstorming. Those are all different methods. However, something to keep in mind is there is not one method that covers all of the risks. Instead, we have to use a combined approach. We have to do a bunch of them together in order to cover all of our bases. Identification is one of the most important steps in the risk management process. And what that does is it lowers the likelihood of other possible instances happening. All right, now let's talk about risk assessment. Now, this is a really important element of risk management because this is actually something you'll do if you work in risk management, GRC, privacy, risk management. Risk assessment is really popular. It's essentially a process where you identify, analyze, and evaluate the cybersecurity threats and weaknesses. What is the purpose of a risk assessment? The goal is essentially to find out what are the risks, how likely is it to happen, and then what is the impact? What is the risk? What is the threat? How likely is it to happen? And what's impact? Anytime you think risk assessment, think impact. Okay, that's the ultimate goal. We want to know the exact impact. Yes, we want to identify what the threats are, but then we also want to be able to measure that impact. This is one of the things that I've done in the past, because typically, it's when we want to know how secure a system is, if there are any potential risks to it. Now, keep in mind, this is not a vulnerability assessment, which tends to be more technical. This is essentially a lot more high level. It's looking at how you can make smarter decisions and then what you could focus your resources on to reduce risk effectively, okay? So, one of the other reasons why you really want to do risk assessment is potentially compliance. Maybe there are laws or regulations or industry best practices that require you to do risk assessments. This is very, very common because with risk assessments can be done outside of risk management. Anyone can do a risk assessment if they have the right tools. So the idea here is that you want to build what we call resilience. Resilience is making sure that if something were to happen, well, then you're helping teams respond better to the entire situation. So what are parts of a risk assessment? Well, the risk assessment includes risk identification. So we already talked about that. It's identifying the weaknesses and vulnerabilities and threats, and then consider the consequences if those were to happen. Then there's risk analysis. That's when you estimate how likely each risk is to occur. With risk management, you're going to give a risk level. So you're going to be able to measure it and decide, okay, how damaging could it be? What is the financial impact of it? We'll talk a little bit more about the quantitative and qualitative methods to estimate it. That'll come later. But then comes risk evaluation. This is where you compare the risk level against your organization's standard. This is where we take in risk acceptance and risk tolerance, because then we get to decide which risks are we going to say is acceptable and which ones we need to take immediate action on. Typically, this comes in the process of a risk registrar. Um, After the break, I will pull up a sample risk registrar. I think, I think that I might have. I'll have to look it up amongst all my things, but I'll pull up a risk registrar so you all can see it, kind of have an idea of what that looks like. Now, how does that apply to cybersecurity? Well, we already identified those three. First one, if there's a phishing attack, we need to have monitoring tools to know if a malicious link was clicked. And then we need to recognize if there are vulnerabilities like weak passwords or if there's lacking encryption or outdated software. Risk analysis is when we see what is the likelihood of phishing attacks. This can be done by just seeing how many phishing attacks are we getting, how many are trying to enter our network. And then we want to know what the impact of it is. And then risk evaluation is if the risk is acceptable and if it's a low likelihood or low likelihood, high likelihood, or high impact. Typically, when you find a risk that is high likelihood and high impact, well, then these are the risks you want to take care of immediately because they're the ones that are most important. Now, let me give you an example. A high likelihood is if your CEO just did like a really big interview and got like 35 million views on that interview. Well, then the likelihood of him receiving a phishing email actually goes up, and the impact is also up as well, especially if there is negative news. So if you all weren't aware, the regular news that happens in the world does impact the cybersecurity world. If you don't know, there was a certain CEO. He went to I think it was a certain concert with a band or something, and he was found in a very compromising position with someone who was not his wife. So he's a CEO of a major company. Now, if I were the cybersecurity resource of that company, I would immediately say, hey, turn on two-factor authentication for all of our leadership, turn on all two-factor authentication for all of our users, make sure there's encryption on all of our data, make sure to protect all of the data of our CEO, make sure to add monitoring on his laptop, on his computer and everything, because he did something that was seen as like controversial, so people might go after him. That is what we consider high likelihood and high impact, which would equal a high risk. Then you want to do what we call importance of continuous assessment. All this means is you're not just doing a risk assessment once. Typically, you'll do a risk assessment at a minimum annually, especially if there's been major changes to your organization. The idea is that you're doing it continually to make sure it keeps moving forward. Yep, Ben got it correctly. All right. And then last one for this topic, let's kind of break down what we call quantitative versus qualitative. So when we're talking about risk assessment, we're talking about the severity, likelihood of something happening and its impact. Now, there are two ways that you can approach risk assessment. First, there's qualitative, which is based on quality or judgment. And then there's quantitative, which is based on science and numbers. These are two ways you can approach it. Now, the first one is qualitative risk assessment. When we're talking about qualitative risk assessment, we're talking about judgment-based methods. So meaning it's not based on numbers, not quote unquote data, but we're evaluating how likely a risk is to happen and how bad its impact would be just through like conversation. So if we're talking brainstorming, interviewing, that kind of stuff is qualitative, where it's based on judgment. Now, when we're talking about like how exactly do we measure it? It's measured in high, medium, or low. Some of the ways that we can gather this information is through like doing a brainstorming session where we do the likelihood and impact of a risk. And then we kind of talk through it. Another one is where we do a scenario review where we're bringing in different people or different experts that can give us their opinions. Maybe look at historical instances that happened before. Maybe we look at industry best practices. Now, these are all examples of qualitative, that is judgment based. Now, an example of this is if we have a new software vulnerability and we're looking at it and see how easy it is to exploit and how valuable the data is. So this is all judgment based. So why is this important? Why do we need to know this, and what are the advantages? Well, one of the things is qualitative, it tends to take a lot less time, which means that it's really quick and easy. And then it doesn't require us to look at a bunch of numbers and data. Now, this is really great because if we're starting this out from scratch and we've never done a risk assessment before, doing this makes it simple. However, it can be biased. It can be inconsistent because we don't have solid numbers to run by. It's essentially a little more difficult. And if you have a C-suite executive that says, hey, can you justify this to me? Well, then you say, well, it's based on expert opinion. We've talked about it. But what if they say, well, we want hard data to explain it. We want hard numbers to explain it. That's when the qualitative way of doing risk assessment goes down. Now, in the opposite side, we have what we call quantitative risk assessment. Now, quantitative risk assessment is numbers-based. It is data-based. It is science-based. It's where we're looking at data and math to measure how likely a risk is and how much it would cost the organization. A lot of C-suite executives love this because they see the number and it makes sense to them. This is using what we call probabilities. It's using the dollar amount to measure loss, and then it gives us an expected loss value per se. Now, how do you do this? Well, there are a bunch of different scenarios. There's one such as the Monte Carlo, their Monte Carlo simulation. This is where you run a lot of possible what-if scenarios to predict the result. If anyone has seen, I think it was one of the Avengers movies towards the end, there's a scene where Doctor Strange, he goes through a million possibilities to see if they beat Thanos and they only win one. That's an example of a Monte Carlo simulation. And then they have what they call a Bayesian network, which is essentially a way where you're using past data and logic to forecast outcomes. That's all it is. So what are some examples in cybersecurity? Well, if you estimate how often a ransomware attack happens and how much damage it causes over time, then you can kind of predict that in the future. So then you could say your annual risk for a ransomware attack is XYZ. So what are the advantages of quantitative? Well, like we mentioned, it's measurable, it's using data, and it's pretty clear. You're saying, hey, we use these numbers from the past, and it's pretty scientifically proven. We've done the math. It's really great because it helps with forecasting, it helps with planning. C-suite executives love it because it's very quantitative, and then it really helps with decision-making overall. Now, what are the downsides? I'll say it right now, it can be a little expensive because you're using a lot of data, a lot of math in order to do this. So you need to have a lot of good data. Also, I said that qualitative, which is quality-based, which is decision-based, takes a lot of, it's pretty quick. Well, quantitative takes a lot of time. It's very time-consuming. Now, since we are talking about science, we are talking about data, keep in mind that data can be wrong. It's good data in, good data out, right? So this is really important stuff. Okay, if you're going to remember anything about this slide, just remember that qualitative data, qualitative assessment is based on judgment. It's not based on data or on numbers, it's on judgment. You rate the risk as low, medium, or high, and it's really good in early stages or in stages where people are trying to build out their risk management program. Whereas the opposite is quantitative. Quantitative Quantitative is using math. It's using data to essentially assign a risk value. It's really good for forecasting. It's really good to give to C-suite executive for planning. Now, both of these approaches, they have their strengths and weaknesses, but believe it or not, they're often used together. There's often a hybrid. There's no rule that says, oh, you can only do qualitative risk assessments or only do quantitative risk assessments. There are both. All right, let's go ahead and do a quick pause. All right, so here is an example of a risk registrar. Now, as a reminder, a risk registrar is where you have a list of all the risks that are associated in your organization, and then you care about two things, their likelihood and their impact. Now, the risk registrar is a direct output from your risk assessment, whether you're doing a brainstorming session, whether you're doing a qualitative or quantitative risk assessment. But in this case, it's kind of a combination of both. Now, I want to break it down. On the left-hand side here, and here, let me paste this link so you all can follow it on your own as well. So on the left-hand side here, you have what we call a risk ID or unique identifier. You need this because if someone says, hey, we need to talk about the ransomware risk, well, that makes it a little difficult. So you want to instead say, hey, we want to talk about risk 001. It gives it a unique identifying name so that you know what people are referencing to. Then there's a risk description. The technology can also be synonymous with the department. And then you're giving it a high or low or medium score. Now, the measurement in this case, the one that I built, it was critical, high, medium, low, because there are four. But you can put these measurements in different formats. So we look at the likelihood, then the impact. The reason why this is at the very top is it's because we have unauthorized access sensitive data due to weak password policies. So if we see it, that's a really high risk, well then we put it as critical and high impact. Then once we do that, we look at a bunch of other factors that give it an inherent score risk or a residual score risk, and then followed by the risk level. Now, if you've never seen the risk level measured this way, it's P0 to P3. So it's P0, P1, P2, P3. Now, the P0 stands for priority zero, meaning you drop everything, and that's what your entire team focuses on. No questions asked. P1 means that it's an extremely high and really important thing, but you need to get clarity from your manager and be like, hey, if this is a P1, that means I have to drop several other things. So, and then a P2 and P3 is a little lower on the totem pole, but that's your priority level, essentially. Then you go into things such as your risk appetite, which we said, hey, we have a very low risk appetite for unencrypted data and risk response strategy. You can either avoid, mitigate, accept, or transfer any of these risks. Now, when you transfer it, you're saying, okay, we're going to outsource this to a third company, a third party. When you mitigate it, that means you fixed it. When you accept it, that means that, oh, we've just accepted it. It is what it is. We have a really high risk appetite for this. And then you have to list out what the actual control is, how you're mitigating it, followed by the effectiveness. Typically, you always want the effectiveness to be high. And then you want to have an action plan followed by dates. Now, all of this, the risk owner, these would actually be people's names. So you want someone to own this so that they're accountable to it. So you say, hey, where are we with this, and this? Followed by a secondary risk owner. You always want to have backups because maybe the primary isn't available. You want to include the cost of the risk if applicable, and then you want to include the review date. Typically, this will also have like several other tabs saying review date 1, review date 2, some form of version control of that risk. And then you have indicators and then possible consequences. Now, this is just an example of a potential risk registrar. So you'll see a lot of different versions as you go through risk management, but the most common things, these are some of the most common columns that you see. I also have a gap analysis example here. So this is a gap analysis that looks at the domains. Then it looks at current state versus target state. So this is essentially saying, hey, this is where we currently are with our potentially our risks or our systems. This is where we want to be. So you'll see it's 30% employees completed security awareness. We want 90% of employees to do security awareness. So that means the gap is a 60% delta. A delta just means that that's the difference between the 30 and the 90. That's all delta means. So we're trying to bridge that gap. Incident response, we responded for 2 hours to an incident. We want our response time to be an hour. So there's a 1 hour delta. So that's the example of a current versus target and then the gap. And then you want to talk about the impact of the gap. The reason why you want to talk about the impact of the gap is so you can tell your employer, hey, this is the reason why this is important. This is the reason why we should change it. I'm showing you this because it's directly applicable to risk management. You need these tools to present and speak to leadership who are the decision makers so that they can make informed decision. Obviously, we talk about priority, which has to be set by the leadership team, followed by root cause, recommendation, resources, date, owner, and status. Now, you won't always see the status here because this goes into project management territory. This means that someone is using this as an active list saying, hey, this is our gap. This is the current status of it. It is in progress, and this one is not started due to priority, but this one is completed. So those are examples of those. And the last thing I wanted to give you all is actually just a gift. So this is something that I created a while ago. You all have been doing so well in this course. So I wanted to share this gift with you all so that you all can kind of do your own form of assessment. I'm not going to call it a risk assessment, but it's just your own assessment of yourself. Now, if you don't know any of these, that's completely okay. The idea is just to at least know some of them. So first thing before I share it, please don't edit this document. Instead, just make a copy of it in your own Google Drive. But what this is what I call a cybersecurity skill and proficiency matrix. Since we're talking about gap analysis and risk registrars, I figured this would be something that some people could use. The idea here is these are some of the most common and well-known elements of cybersecurity. So for one, you should know what all of these are, what all of these do, or at the very least, be able to define any of these terms. So the idea here is you can make a copy of this spreadsheet, and then when you're working in it, you can give yourself a rating of 1 to 5. 5 meaning I know this really well, inside and out. I can talk about all the different firewalls, next generation firewall, where they land, where they should be, that kind of stuff. I can define it. Whereas 1 is, I don't even know what this thing is. The idea is for you to do an honest assessment of yourself and find out how much you know about each of these tools so that you find out where your gaps are, where your quote unquote risks are for an interview. So when you do this, it essentially, you're able to know where you can focus your energy on knowing it. I can tell you right now, you want to know a SIEM inside and out. You want to be able to say, I've logged into Splunk. I know how to look at Splunk, even a little bit. Now, I'm not saying you're required to make this, to have a 5 on all of these. That's not what I'm saying. That's not fully required. What I am at least encouraging you to do is be familiar with what all of these are. Be familiar with being able to explain all of these, like I typically say, in your own words, in a way that makes sense for you. So hopefully you all enjoy this little gift from the Correlation 1 team and I. All right, let's continue forward with the lecture. Ah, you're very welcome, Peter. Appreciate the appreciation. Okay, so we talked about risk assessment. We talked about the elements of risk. We've talked about how risk and vulnerability and impact are all relevant. Saida says, we've been waiting for these things for a long time. Oh, you're very welcome, Saida. I have so many of these type of tools. I'm trying not to overwhelm you all by just giving you the massive full list, but I'm just trying to give it to you bit by bit so that you can digest it. I encourage you to complete it, maybe create a version 1 and then kind of do a version 2 a couple months later. But that's completely up to you. You are very welcome, Wajiha. You all are so nice. Man, I love this cohort. You guys are great. Okay, let's talk about risk management. So when we're talking about risk management, I want to give you all a definition. So Harvard Business Review calls risk management the systematic process of identifying, assessing, and mitigating threats or uncertainties. The idea here is systematic. They're really looking at concepts like likelihood and impact, as I showed you in that sample risk registrar. Their main focus is on strategies to reduce harm and then monitoring the effectiveness of these strategies. The entire risk management framework is centered around decreasing the likelihood and the impact, which is why I firmly believe in the industry of GRC, which stands for governance, risk, and compliance. It is literally centered around proactive measures to reduce the likelihood and impact of an incident happening. Now, the risk management process is a really huge part of that. So, what exactly is uh, what exactly is the risk management framework? Well, the risk management framework is broken down into multiple components. Oh, I missed a section. Sorry. Um, and it's kind of broken down like this. You want to identify the potential risks first, then you want to evaluate their severity and likelihood. Then you want to develop strategies to reduce the risk, not just reduce the risk, but either mitigate the risk to get rid of it, to transfer the risk, to accept the risk. You need to make a decision on the overall risk. And then you need to do continuous monitoring and to improve those strategies as well as do additional assessments. And keep in mind, as we're going through all this, keep the concept of risk versus reward. So I mentioned the risk management framework. Well, what exactly is the risk management framework? Which, by the way, uh, a quick sidebar. Anytime you hear the term framework, all it's describing is how to do XYZ. It's giving you a bubble in which you can operate there within. So when we're talking about a risk management framework, a GRC framework, incident response framework, these are essentially how to do these steps. That's all it is. So there are five steps that I want to go through with you. When we're talking about the risk management framework, the first step, like we had talked about before, is identification. This means that we want to find out what those risks are. We need to identify the risks. Then we need to catalog the risks accordingly. Not only are we looking at some of the risks, but remember, risk involves the threats and vulnerabilities. So there are two parts. First, you want to look at all the threats that exist in your business, and then you want to look at all the vulnerabilities that exist in your business. You need to identify them, be able to spot them. What this does is this helps create a picture of what could go wrong. Keep in mind, with risk management, you're trying to find out things that haven't happened yet, but that could potentially happen. Sure, you may use past incidences, you may use past lessons learned, you may even look at the history of what has happened to similar companies in your industry. That can be used to give you an idea of what to identify, what to look for. So Once you've done the identification step of risk management, then you go to the assessment. This is where the risk assessment takes place. So we're looking at all of the risks, and then we're going to rank and categorize each of them based off of likelihood, impact, and scope. So when we're looking at the anticipated impact or the severity of all of these, this does one thing and one thing only. It is meant to help us prioritize which ones to do first. So in this risk registrar, as you can see, high likelihood, high impact means this is what we're going to address first. If it's something with a low, I don't have any low lows, but a low medium, well, then it's lower on our list. So we're less worried about them. So example, unavailability of key raw materials. So that means not able to create certain products. Well, the likelihood of that is low. The impact of that is medium. So we don't want to worry about that so much. When you have a risk registrar that's able to give you the likelihood, impact, and scope, well, then you can then use that as a jump off point to essentially decide, where do I want to focus my team's energy? Where do I want us to essentially put all of our time, effort, and money into? Excuse me. Okay. After you have the assessment phase, which helps you with prioritization, you go into mitigation. The mitigation step is where you create a list of responses to each risk. You essentially create a list of playbooks. Now, remember, in this case, it wouldn't exactly be a playbook because a playbook says, hey, this is what you do when an incident happens. But with a mitigation, you're creating a library of responses. You're essentially saying, hey, what are the responses that we have to take in case this risk were to occur? That means it could be like training, it could be controls, it could be backups. Excuse me. It could be anything that would prevent or lower the likelihood of that risk happening overall. Now, keep in mind, when we're talking about risk, it's different from talking about an incident. An incident, something has happened. There is a definite thing that happened that will cause, that'll have a certain effect, a certain consequence. With a risk, it has not happened yet. That's why we're talking about backups, controls, policies, training. These are all proactive things that you do before the risks take place. The idea here and the goal is to reduce or eliminate the the impact of that happening and the likelihood of that risk happening. So that's the entire goal, is to reduce that risk or get rid of that risk entirely. That is what the mitigation step is for. That's why there is an entire definition of mitigation when it comes to risk response. Mitigate means that you've solved it. It's done. You don't have to register it as a risk anymore. Typically, if that risk is done, well, then you'll mark it as done, and then the logic of this tool will essentially get rid of it. Now, someone asked me earlier if there's a tool that could be used to make that can be used to do risk assessment a lot easier. Yes, there is. One of them is called Risk Connect. So this is the one that I personally like and that I think a lot more people should use. It is a risk management software where it essentially helps you with BCPs, which is business continuity plans, or BIAs, which are business impact assessments. And it essentially puts everything into one roof, makes it a lot easier. They have implemented some AI tools that are able to do preemptive scanning. They have templating features. This is a really, really cool tool. It's not the only one out there. There are things such as like Audit Board as well. We got a question here. Alex, I see your question. I would say those aren't as important for this lesson. We might dig into those a little later. You can look those up on ChatGPT if you'd like, but that gets a little bit more technical. It goes into some math and some logic and whatnot. Eric asks, what's the difference between gap analysis and risk assessment on security? No, that's actually a relevant question. So, um, A gap analysis does not have to be security oriented, right? But it is typically used when you're saying, hey, what is our security posture? Is our security posture, we have segmented networks, we took out all unnecessary ports and services, all that. You're looking at where we are, and then you're looking at where we want to be. This is current versus future state. I can see where that could be confused with risk assessment because risk assessment isn't looking at current state and future state. It kind of does, but instead it's looking at what are the threats that exist? What are the vulnerabilities that we have? And how can we fix them? The key element and the key differences, Eric, is the threat piece. A gap analysis is just saying, do we have a data server? Does it say a data server need to be upgraded? Whereas this, with risk assessment, we're looking at actual threats. Hopefully that answers your question. And to the person who asked me earlier, what is the software? This is one. There's also another one called Audit Board. Now, Audit Board is a tool that is mainly used for GRC, which stands for governance, risk, and compliance, but they do have a risk management element. So this is another tool. It's really, really powerful. I suggest that you all follow them on LinkedIn, which, by the way, as a quick suggestion, if you want your LinkedIn to be a lot more cybersecurity oriented, try to like all of the companies, all of the solutions out there. Try to follow a bunch of cybersecurity professionals. If you're ever curious of who to follow, just go to my LinkedIn, look at who I follow, look at the things that I repost, because I tend to repost a lot of really interesting cybersecurity stuff. You can look at some of the groups I'm part of. It's a really great way to turn your LinkedIn into a fully cybersecurity focused feed. So this is another tool that you can also use. So after we get to the mitigation, one of the reasons why tools are important is because it helps with reporting and monitoring. If you set up this tool correctly, well, then your C-suite executives can essentially say, hey, I need a report on all of our risks for Q1. You just go into the tool, you generate the report, and it automatically spits out the data that you want. A lot of these reports, I know that Risk Connect and Audit Board have customizable reporting, which means that you can say, only include risks that are a P0 and a P1, only include risks that are a $100,000 impact or more. And then you can kind of like curate it to what you need. Now, this isn't just for C-suite executives. They could also be for auditing. So if you're going to be audited, well, then you can essentially use these tools as such. Then there is governance. Now, governance is the process where you organize people, roles, and data. A very common occurrence when you hear governance is people think, oh, this means that it's in relation to the government because as we're governing it. So that's a misconception. Governance is associated with the organization of people, roles, and data specifically to manage that risk. The idea here with governance is you're ensuring accountability and you keep the framework running smoothly. Okay, that's all governance is. If we're talking about what the government is doing, well, then that goes into the realm of regulation. Regulation is what the government is doing to impact us. So if I were to recap all of this, I would say that the risk management frameworks are a way to help organizations identify and reduce the threats effectively. They do so by the five core elements, which is identification, assessment, mitigation, reporting and monitoring, and governance. Okay, so that is a really big look into risk management frameworks. That being said, there is not just one risk management frameworks, there are actually several. And so we're going to run through a couple of them. One of the ones that you should know right off the bat is the NIST risk management framework. We've run into NIST a lot in this course. And something you should know is that it is really, really respected in the cybersecurity space. Are GRC jobs affected by AI? Abdul, that's a great question. They are not. Again, this is in relation to decision making. AI can gather data, they can do vulnerability scans, but they can't, for example, AI cannot do a quantitative they cannot do a qualitative risk assessment. That requires humans. Humans need to be able to have a conversations. AI can't know, oh, we have this server and it has data that's unencrypted, but we have one person who encrypts it manually every day. AI can't know that. AI can gather data, it can inform GRC, but decision making has to be done at a human level. So it is going to help your job. It's not essentially going to take away your job. So NIST stands for the National Institute of Standards and Technology. It's a highly respected organization in the cybersecurity industry. And the idea with NIST here is what they do is they integrate security and privacy into one big ecosystem. So everything from planning to deployment, the NIST management framework is centered around that. Now, in this case, we're talking about the risk management framework because NIST has a bunch of different frameworks. In this case, it's just risk management. So what they're doing here is this framework is, again, focusing on the proactive element of risk management instead of the reactive. Reactive is incident response. Proactive is risk management. Proactive is GRC. So what are the focuses? The main focuses of this is they're focused on continuous monitoring. The reason why is because throughout the years, they've seen that people will implement risk management, but after they do that, after they get their risk registrar down to a lower number, they tend to forget. They're like, okay, we mitigated the risk, we're done. Well, you need to do continuous monitoring because organizations are going to change, they're going to grow. So you want to make sure that um, you're doing the right early and ongoing improvements as well as monitoring. Also, the risk management frameworks, it does help them align with federal regulations. This is especially important if you're going to be working in the government sector because the government sector has a very low risk appetite. So that means they don't like risk very much at all. So how do you break down these steps? Now, the steps for risk management for NIST is a little different. They're broken down into 7. The first one is prepare. So where this is where you set the responsibilities, you set the context, you make sure you have everything prepared. Then you categorize. So you identify information types and system impact levels. So you make sure that you're listing out an impact analysis to them, then you select. So you have a set of, you can choose appropriate security controls level. So there's NIST SP 853. This is a list of controls that you can put against your system or your organization to see where you stand. There's also something called CMMC. So CMMC is another compliance standard which let's see if it pulls up the right one. Yes, cybersecurity maturity model certification. So it's essentially a framework used by the government, DoD in America, to essentially input all very mature security controls. And they have about, if I'm not mistaken, 109 different controls. And believe you me, each control could be a project in and of itself. So if you take on CMMC, it's a lot. Then you implement those chosen controls. After that, you assess and evaluate how well the controls are doing. And then you authorize, meaning you make a risk-based decision to approve the system use or to approve that risk statement, followed by monitoring. You monitor and you track the control and effectiveness of those updates. Now, with CMMC, they have a numerical value. They have 0 to 5. 0 being we don't have this control at all. 5 means that we have this control at a high maturity level. 3 means that we have this control. It has some security features in it, but it's not like extremely high. So these are all the steps that are associated with NIST. Then there's what you call TERA. So TERA is a threat assessment and remediation analysis. So all this is made by the MITRE ATT&CK framework. So you should be familiar with the MITRE ATT&CK framework because it is centered around cybersecurity research. But what it focuses on is um, it looks to understand the realistic threats rather than generic vulnerabilities. So it's a lot more pointed, it's a lot more direct, meaning you're doing a lot of extensive threat intelligence, you're doing a lot of research, you're doing a lot of threat modeling. Again, threat modeling is kind of like you play pretend where you say, hey, we're simulating an attack, we're using these systems, but it gets more complex with the Terra framework. Now, the Terra framework is broken down into 3 easy steps. So the steps are where I would call it where you do an assessment of the scope. So this is where you define which system or data are being evaluated, and then you narrow it down to find the high value and high risk assets or areas. Then you do an analysis, also known as CTSA. I never called it that. I always just call it analysis, where you identify applicable threats and attack methods, and then you map it out. You draw a picture of the threats to existing systems, typically the high importance ones, and the exposures, followed by mitigation. You essentially solve it. You put mitigation steps in place, and throughout the whole thing, you do what? As I'm sure you all have guessed already, you document it. You document throughout so that if someone is joining the organization for the first time, they just have to read the documentation and know what was done, by who, and how. There's also another framework called COSO. So COSO is for enterprise. If you remember, whenever you hear the word enterprise, it's essentially just means really, really big. Think Amazon, Google, Facebook, really big organizations. It is meant to not just do risk management at the corporate strategy level, but it's meant to be something to aim for long term. The idea here is think of it as like a cube, right? So at the very top, you have strategic objectives. At the front, you have like components and actions. And at the sides, you have the business units and the functions. So the top kind of like controls like where we're going, what we're trying to do. And then the front are the things or actions that we can do. And then the sides are the people doing it. So what are the components? Well, the components are broken down as such. First, you have to evaluate internal environment. That means that you look at your organization. When I say look at your organization, I'm looking at culture. I'm talking macro. You're asking yourself, what are our company values? Is integrity a piece of it? Reason why integrity is a piece of a value inside an organization is, yes, to foster that culture, but it's also to reduce insider threat. Then you want to look at ethics. Is our company operating ethically? Have we had any scandals? Is the leadership team ethical? Then we have to look at risk tolerance. What is our risk tolerance? Is it really high? Is it really low? Then you go into objective setting. In simple terms, this is where you look at your goals and your missions for your organization, and then you incorporate a risk strategy. You align it with the risk strategy, saying, all right, our goal is to 3x the business. We want to make 3 times as much this year than last year. That is the goal. Well, then what is the risk associated with that? Well, if we're trying to 3x, that means we have to grow. We have to use more systems. If we use more systems, there's more cost. More cost means that we have a bigger attack vector that we need to cover. So you need to keep those in mind. Then there's event identification. So this is where you identify the risks and opportunities that affect the objectives. So this is where you do your risk assessment, whatnot. Sorry. And then you do the risk assessment. This is where you analyze the likelihood, vulnerability, impacts, and interdependencies, followed by the risk response. This is the mitigation step. So you choose whether you want to mitigate it, whether you want to reduce it, accept it, transfer it, or avoid it completely. Avoiding it means, hey, we have a third party and they have this risk. Well, then the leadership team can say, okay, we're going to get rid of this third party immediately. That means avoiding the risk. Then you do control activities, which is focused around defining the procedures and policies to manage risk, Information and communication, you set up monitoring and alerts, followed by continuous monitoring, which is the last one, where you're doing continuously reviewing and refining the risk response process. This is the cube that I was talking about. Objective, and then the sides are the business units and assets, and then the front is the components. So that's COSO. After COSO, we have something called, I think I missed one. Yeah, I missed one. After COSO, we have something called COBIT. So COBIT stands for Controlled Objects for Information and Related Technology, COBIT. COBIT was developed by ISACA. If you don't know what ISACA is, especially if you're wanting to get into GRC risk management, you should know them because ISACA is the governing body for a lot of IT governance. So that stands for International Professional Association, or sorry, it is associated with the International Professional Association focused on IT governance. That's why GRC is so associated with them. Fun story. There are a bunch of GRC certifications that you can get through them. So I highly suggest that you check those out. COBIT is one of them. So in case you didn't know, you can be certified in a specific framework or in a specific auditing type because when you put on your resume that you're a certified COBIT, certified ISO, certified PCI DSS, that gives you credentials to be able to take on those auditing uh, those audits. So I would definitely have you check out ISACA. Now, COBIT is centered on, again, more enterprise, meaning that it's looking into large-scale IT environments. It covers infrastructure, data. It's a lot more network-oriented and very, very, I would say, very, very technical. So it's really focused on making sure that your IT team is aligned with business goals and initiatives, and it has really well-defined processes. Now, there are 20 different risk scenarios, and it kind of breaks down a lot, but I'll tell you what, COBIT, it's something that we could spend an entire class on itself. So what I would just say is that what COBIT focuses on is data, IT processes, and vendor issues, as well as potential compliance failures. So if you fail compliance with COBIT, that means that you failed in IT. Failure in compliance is not an option when you're working in GRC. You have to pass. So that's why it's so important. And C-suite executive eyes are on this. So you do have to do well in that. Okay. So if I were to summarize these two, I would say that COSO is focused a lot more on risk actions and businesses, aligning the business goals with the security and risk objectives. And then COBIT is really IT focused. It's focused on IT risk and governance, and it has really clear objectives focused on tech infrastructure, your IT infrastructure. So let's now move on to standards. You might be asking, well, what is a standard? A standard is a voluntary guideline or best practice that your organization uses to become more secure. So it's to reduce their risk. Now, I say voluntary because a standard is not required. You are not required by law to adhere to these standards. However, it is a best practice. When you follow them, that means that you can say, hey, we follow all the right industry standards and regulations, which means that it only improves your security posture as well as improves your reputation to stakeholders and customers. The idea here with the standard is that it shows or it exemplifies consistency, clarity, competency, confidence, and that your risk management strategies are top notch. Well, what are some examples of standards? There is the CIS controls, which is very common. That stands for the Center for Internet Security. What this is there are 18 different measures, and the idea is that it simplifies and enhances your overall cybersecurity. And you can look at any of these on your own. They do have their own website. What this does is it essentially helps the organization comply with industry regulations. It helps them improve their cybersecurity. It helps them adapt, and it helps them just raise their overall cybersecurity maturity. Now, there is also the NIST SP 853. That's one that you'll see very often as well. So the NIST 853, it's a catalog of controls. Remember, we said you pick a framework of controls and you implement it to your organization. Now, just because you're implementing it to your organization does not mean that every single one of these controls is required. You can say, oh, this control does not apply to us because we don't hold customer credit card data. So we don't need to have this. So with the NIST 853, it gives you a catalog of controls that you can work against. What it does is it looks at risks such as natural disasters, any threats, any political or government interruptions. And the idea with NIST is that it is customizable. You can adjust the controls you want to use based on what industry you're in. If you're trying to be federally accredited or work with federal governments, let's say you're a defense contractor, well, then you can essentially use, there's a whole other framework for government, but you could use NIST as something to go off of. Now, one of the things that sets NIST apart is their Security and Privacy Control Collaboration Index. It's essentially it's a access control with privacy and security measures at the forefront. So if you're doing regular access control, well, then you say, hey, you can't access this because you're not part of this department. Instead, it goes into security and privacy, saying, all right, you can't access this because, yes, you're not part of this department, but this is sensitive customer data. And by law, by the government, no one except for these three people can access it. So it's like more in-depth access control, if you will. Then you have the very, very well-known ISO 27001. I've worked on this before, and it is a beast. So this is created, it's an international standard. If you work internationally, you'll run through this, where it focuses on information security management system. So essentially, this is where we're looking at proactive risk management. You're looking at people, processes, and technology, PPT, people, processes, and technology, and it's focused on the CIA triad, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Now, all of these focus on the CIA triad, but ISO really focuses on it. Everything is kind of leaning back to that. And then you have the ability to change its size and sector. It is customizable. But the ISO 27001, if you're looking at getting into risk, that's a really good certification to get into. Now, there's also the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. The difference between NIST SP 803 and the NIST Cybersecurity Framework is that this one is only focused on U.S. critical infrastructure. So this is government related. It was made originally for that, but now it is adopted across all industries. What's good about this is that it kind of makes things a little simpler. It only breaks things down into 3 steps. So the core, which is where a set of cybersecurity activities and outcomes, and then you have implementation tiers, where you help assess risk tolerance and resource readiness, and then profiles, tailored strategies for aligning cybersecurity goals with business priorities. Now, there's a new version of the CSF that was released, I think in 2024. So you can go check that out. But the benefit of the NIST cybersecurity framework is that it's flexible and it's cost effective. Now, keep in mind, these are standards, which means that it's not required for you to do them, but is a good idea to do them. It's like a really strong suggestion, I guess you could say. Now, when we're talking about standards, the opposite of a standard is called a regulation. So what is a regulation? A regulation is a government, a legally mandated procedure in order to reduce risk and limit potential harm. So this is literally derived from the government. This is involuntary. You have to do this, and you are required to be compliant by law. You'll hear that word a lot if you get into GRC is compliance. You need to be compliant. If an organization is not compliant, typically they'll run into things such as fines. They could even run into lawsuits. They could even run into certain sanctions and whatnot, especially if you're a publicly traded company. Now, with regulations, there are elements of reporting that are mandatory. So you need to make sure that you report things on a certain cadence, especially if you are at risk of not being compliant. You need to report and document all your preventative controls, which is risk management, being proactive. And then you need to have an emergency plan in place. With these regulations, you typically need to have some form of response, some form of BCP in place. So there's one thing that's called the EPA Management Program that stands for Environmental Protection Agency. This is essentially applied to US-based facilities, and it's really just saying, hey, we are a regulation that is trying to keep the world still safe. So they're trying to handle hazardous chemicals, um, hazardous chemicals ethically. It's meant to prevent like oil spills or chemical spills that could have an impact on the environment or on humans. So the EPA is just saying, hey, don't dump your chemicals or your oil into this river that people use to like get into their crops. That's an example of a regulation because it's really focused on like a clean energy and a clean environment. Then you have the Cybersecurity Reporting for Critical Infrastructure Act of 2022. So this is enforced by CISA. Now you should be familiar with CISA because CISA is the government entity that gives us the wonderful gift of CVEs. Again, that's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. And their entire goal here is around risk mitigation. So that's why they give you CVEs so that you know, hey, these are all of the issues associated with this tool that we're using. And so it's meant to prevent or to mitigate risk as well as give you an easy way to do breach reporting. So they're again focused on critical infrastructure. When I'm talking about critical infrastructure, think like think communally, water, electricity, oil, gas, sewage, local governments. These are critical infrastructures that need to still function in order for our society to still function. So they do things such as access management, protecting against DDoS attacks, meaning that if there's a DDoS attack lasting more than 12 hours, phishing, ransomware, malware, these are some of the most common threats that happen in the world. Right now, the two biggest ones are still phishing and ransomware. So this is a really good thing for you to know. If someone ever asks you, um, hey Dan, what are the biggest threats in cybersecurity right now? Well, you already know it's this list. You already know it's phishing and ransomware. It's DDoS attacks. It's unauthorized access. These are all very, very common. So the goal of this regulation is essentially to input proactive steps to protect it. So I talked about how regulations are mandatory and how you need to get them done and there's no choice but to complete them. Well, this is enforced by the government, this is enforced by law, and it is not voluntary like standards are. So what are the consequences if you don't adhere to them? Well, one of the things that you can see is from an ethical standpoint, if you don't adhere to EPA rules, well, then you could see an impact from a public health perspective. You could see it from a personal data perspective because the EPA has rules to protect human health, like physical human health. So if you don't follow these regulations, there are really, really heavy consequences, not just short term, but potentially long term as well. Not just for the organization, but the individuals. Keep in mind, if we, let's say, are a cybersecurity company and we build networking tools that do a lot of monitoring. And we build those tools, like we actually build those physical tools. When we build them, well, then we produce chemicals through the building process. If we dump those chemicals into the river or into the ocean, well, then wildlife could be affected, fishers could be affected, fish could be affected, which in turn fishermen, and then so on and so forth. And that would lead back to us. So that would be a really huge consequence. We're gonna ignore the let's go company thing for a while. Let's kind of talk a little bit broader. So there's data loss. Like for that T app that we said, customer data is really valuable. And so if we don't do proper planning and if we don't do the right controls in place, well, then hackers may leak it and steal it, send it to our competitors, to the dark web. There could be ransomware attacks that could permanently lock any of the companies out, and then we would lose a lot of services. Our operations would be incredibly impacted. So an example, the T-Mobile one, that one was an old one. The one I would direct you to is more recent, the Salt Typhoon one that impacted all of the carriers, T-Mobile, Sprint, Verizon, all of the ones in the United States. Those were the ones that are impacted. You could look that up. Yeah, that's not ethical at all. And then there's damage to customer trust and company reputation. These are all macro level items, meaning that they're societal. So a single breach can really reduce public confidence. Just look at what happened with LastPass. I know that right now LastPass they're still really functional and they kind of wiggled their way out, but me personally, after they've been hacked, I think 2 or 3 times, I just transferred all of my stuff into Keeper. And that's my like whatchamacallit. That's my password manager of choice. So that's really just it. Company reputation and customer trust. If you do have, you're not compliant, well, then that could be a huge hit. There's also profit loss. So if you are a publicly traded company, well, then if you ever experience a data breach or if there's any stocks associated, well, then you'll see an immediate decline in your profits because stock prices are impacted by the news, and investors are going to move and make decisions based off of the news associated with your company. So you want to make sure that you are in compliance so that this doesn't happen to you. Yep. So an example is Okta. They're still functioning now, but they did have a hack, and so that was pretty bad because Okta, it's a two-factor authentication tool that's used pretty worldwide. Some people still use them today. But after they had that hack, a lot of people lost a lot of interest. Then there's fines and lawsuits. I already explained that one before. And so those are like some of the biggest consequences. Now, we will talk more in depth about risk management in the next class. There are a lot more regulations that will impact a good chunk of you. But if I were to summarize some of these consequences, I would say that non-compliance and poor risk management can lead to not just fines, but macro level items such as business damage business operations. It can damage your reputation. It can damage your long-term growth. If you're a startup and you get hacked, well, then that's a really huge problem because down the line, people might say, "Hey, didn't you get hacked X years ago?" And you have to respond to that. Then there's also, if you're not compliant with any of these regulations or not compliant with risk management, you could experience data loss. You could experience that could be in a hack, that could be in the leak, that could be like what happened to T, where they lost all of those pictures. I guarantee you that all of the women who upload their pictures now, they feel incredibly unsafe with that app because they did not follow the right cybersecurity procedures. So there's loss of trust there. There's also financial harm and legal actions. The T app is going through so much difficulty right now. They're probably getting sued so much, not just by the women, but there's also been like some internal people suing the company because they weren't aware that the cybersecurity team didn't put all the security measures on that data server. And then the organization, that's why organizations, they have to build a culture of compliance and security because it builds both their customer, it protects both their customer and themselves. This statement is one of the primary reasons why I got into cybersecurity training and awareness, is because I'm trying to show the next generation of cybersecurity professionals that technology is important. Yes, very. But our weakest link are people. Our weakest link are companies. We have to change the culture to be more security minded, to have more integrity, to have more ethical standards. Because if you operate at that level of excellence from integrity and ethics, well, then you will ensure that someone is double checking that your data servers are encrypted, that your data servers are protected. When you do all of this, this helps protect you and your organization overall. All right, let's get into quiz territory. So let's go into quiz thread. Question number 1. When conducting a risk assessment for Let's Go, which factor is least likely to influence the severity rating of a cybersecurity risk? A, B, C, or D? Answers coming in. We'll zip through here. Everyone says D. That is correct. So the number of staff trained in cybersecurity best practices. Well done. All right, just moving on forward so we can get to the Kahoot. Question number 2. Which of the following best exemplifies a regulatory risk for Let's Go? Regulatory. Remember, regulatory here is associated with the government. That is correct. Implementing a new data protection law in European Union affecting how customer data is handled. This is specifically in relation to GDPR. Question number 3. In prioritizing risks for Let's Go, which of the following risks should be addressed first based on a high risk score? Remember, risk, oh, I don't want to give the answer away. Everyone is saying C. Well done. That is correct. The risk registrar image, I think, hopefully helped if it's high impact, high likelihood, and high impact. You want to put that first. Then question 4. We have monthly meetings with leadership for the security organization at Let's Go to review responses to attacks and vulnerability patches. Which component of risk management does this actively fall under? Review response to attacks and vulnerability patches. Ooh. With leaders. I'm okay. I'm going to go ahead and go with the majority of the questions. And I want to explain this. The reason why it's not D is because the key element here is reporting. Okay. Reporting is when you're meeting with a leader team and you're reporting it as well as you're reviewing response for attacks and vulnerability patches, which means monitoring. So the answer would actually be C. 5. Last question. Before Let's Go signed a contract with a third-party company that pays the phone agents, the security organization conducted an assessment of the third party's history of security and data privacy breaches. Which component of risk management does this activity fall under? This one I think you all got. That is correct. So this is what we call a risk assessment, or very specifically a third-party risk assessment, because you're looking at the third party. Again, that's an actual job. Someone's job can be just third-party assessments. All right. Now, to conclude, some of the key takeaways I would like you all to remember is that when it comes to the risk management framework and risk overall, it's associated with finding the threats and vulnerabilities and its impact, and then prioritizing it accordingly to make sure that you and the team are able to make informed decisions on how to approach it. We have a lot of different frameworks that you can pick from to set all of the proactive risk controls in place. And then we also have standards that you can adhere to. These standards are voluntary, they're not required. Whereas a regulation is a government required a rule that you have to accomplish. So, all of that being said, I think I would say this. Risk management isn't just about protecting systems, okay? Keep in mind, the number one rule in cybersecurity is to protect human life. So with risk management, you're reducing the likelihood and impact of these threats happening. So with risk management, you're also protecting people, you're protecting your reputation, and you're protecting the future of the company. So risk management is not something to scoff at. There's a reason why there's a whole industry around it, and the reason why GRC is hugely on the rise. So with that being said, let's go ahead and move